Russia, and the Epstein files dominate the news these days. They sound like very different stories. But Geoff Gilson, who is a lawyer, author, political strategist, he knew Maggie Thatcher very well. He's here with us, and Jeff thinks that they're the same story with just two different captions. Is that right, Jeff?
Pretty much, John, yes, it is. And before we get talking about this, I think it's important to say one thing, particularly after all the press conferences yesterday. I'm going to be speaking in fairly objective terms about what I've been observing for the last 30 years. And it's going to sound a little cold and heartless. It's not meant to. What Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell have been accused of doing is awful. It's reprehensible.
Reprehensible. I mean,
Reprehensible.
I, I'm I fashioned myself as a Reagan Republican with
Hmm.
a strong libertarian slant. But
Yes.
so what someone does in their personal lives is really not of interest to me. But when someone takes advantage of a defenseless child, it is
Yes.
reprehensible, it is inexcusable, and there is no justification, including our own country's national security, which we'll talk
Yes.
about. But go ahead, I interrupted.
No, 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 no. Hey, John, it's your show. You're allowed to interrupt. Um,
All
but
right, I take full license.
what I want to say is, of course, that's reprehensible, and we all feel for them, and it's wrong and it's abusive. But my point is from my own observations in the last 30 years. And I've got to say, I'm very surprised I'm on your show even saying this because I didn't think it would come to light. Is that behind the Epstein scandal, behind the Russiagate scandal, and other machinations in Washington and globally at the moment, there are other covert agendas, and they are perhaps more impactful on national security and on your ordinary listener, your ordinary viewer, than they realize. And if we, I'm trying to find a sensitive way of saying this. If we are sidetracked by the sensation of the scandal, the obvious sensation, we may miss the deeper covert agendas at play. There are definitely power plays going on in Washington at the moment and around the globe, but they're not the power plays that we think they are. They, all of them, in my opinion, and in my book, trace back to the 80s and then carry forward through association with various names and entities and money trails. And most of what is going on by way of power play in Washington at the moment is nefarious covert operators protecting money and protecting networks. And that's basically what's happening with Epstein and Russiagate.
Well, I share your perspective, and a repetitive theme on this program is talking about the deep state that one of our listeners, who I communicate with regularly and have a great deal of respect for, he's a very bright guy, and he gives me his perspectives on things that help uh, fashion my perspectives. But he calls it the secret state.
Yes.
So you and I share the same perspective, and I've been giving a lot of thought to this recently and analogizing it to other organizations that I've been involved with as a board member. And I've always been somewhat taken aback by the fact that the staff seems to have a disproportionate influence in the outcome of issues than the constituents that we're supposed to serve and the board that is supposed to set the policy. And I think we're seeing that played out in our own federal government right now, where the staff who are supposed to implement the policy is determined by the politicians have seized power and they want to determine the outcome of and the influence of policy rather than the implementation. Have I got that wrong, or
No, no, it's interesting. I mean, I'm going to come back to the secret state point because I think your friend is absolutely right. We're missing the point just calling it the deep state. I think it is the secret state. And
yeah?
if you have, call them what you like, public servants, civil servants, appointees, whatever, who are committed to serving the public, that's fine. That's great, provided they don't develop their own agenda. And particularly if that agenda happens to be a covert and insidious and even criminal agenda, which is what I'm alleging with Epstein and Russiagate. It's not just deep state actors, it's covert, corrupt actors. But just dealing with your one point, and I think you would appreciate this as a lawyer. I've been interested in the US Constitution since I was living in England. I'm in fact American, but I was born and raised in England. Since Jimmy Carter was running for president back in 1976.
I knew Jimmy Carter. I knew Jimmy Carter reasonably well. I knew his wife even better. That they were really fine people.
They were,
Jimmy Carter was inept as a president. Sorry, he was dealt some bad cards, by the way, but
yeah.
his response was not effective.
Yeah. And so I've been interested since then. And the US Constitution is a fascinating instrument, unfortunately full of a lot of holes and whatever. But one of the things that I have been studying is the fact that there is very little, nothing in the Constitution, very little in the Constitution about public employees, other than the fact that the Senate has to confirm some of them. But by and large, public administration at the federal level has been designed by the president over the years, and it has developed a life of its own, particularly due to presidents like Woodrow Wilson, who basically said public administration is far too important not to be on its own. It should train itself, it should discipline itself, and it should be left alone. And I think he is the father of the modern deep state, and it's wrong. I just I've gone back to college late in life, and I've just finished an MPA at Clemson, and I found myself regularly arguing with sort of left-wing public administrators in class, saying, "Well, they'll say, what do you want?" And I said, "Well, I actually think you should go pretty much all the way down the chain, and everybody in public administration should be on contract, and every senior public administrator should be politically appointed, not necessarily by the president, but by the people. Because when you have a new administration, they deserve a public administration which presents itself as being available to implement the policy of the elected officials. They're not supposed to have their own agenda." Well, this caused fury amongst my fellow students who said that we join public administration because we care. Good. And we have our own political views. No, no, you don't. Not in your job, you don't. Your only political view in your job is to implement the agenda of the person who was elected as with oversight over you. And there are a lot of public servants in federal and state employee who don't agree with that.
Well, there are 4 million of them, and a
Yeah,
light bulb just kind of went off in my brain as you were talking. I think you have identified a core problem with our federal government, and that is that you take the President of the United States Congress, and the Supreme Court of the United States. Each of them have guardrails. There are
yes,
bounds to which they cannot cross, and that those guardrails are defined in the United States Constitution.
yes,
Show me the guardrails that apply to the bureaucracy. There are
yeah,
none,
there are none. No,
and they've adopted their own code. And their mantra is, "You're here for 4 years. We were here before you came. We'll be here
yeah,
after you leave. We're in charge." And
yes.
there's nothing right now to prevent them from doing so. So I think you just hit the nail on the head. And we need guardrails for the bureaucracy.
Now, that having been said, and as I mentioned earlier, I think your friend is absolutely right to call it the secret state. What I believe is playing out, especially at the moment, and it's been since Donald Trump came on the federal scene 10 years ago, is covert agendas. I'll start off briefly, and then if you want to ask questions, you can. Basically, it goes back to the 80s and especially to London. I found out about this. I was minding my own business living outside of London with a friend called Hugh Simmons. We were both trying to become members of parliament under Margaret Thatcher. We knew her and had written speeches for her, but we wanted to become members of parliament. All of a sudden, he turns up dead in the woods in November 1988. I didn't understand. Everybody else just wrote it off, but it didn't make any sense to me. $7 million was missing from his law firm's account. I had nothing to do with it, but it didn't make any sense at all. The money was never traced, it just disappeared. I started asking John all the right questions in all the wrong places, discovered that he was a senior officer in British intelligence, had been involved with Margaret Thatcher in that respect also. And in the 80s, there was this major war between Iran and Iraq. They couldn't buy weapons legally. The United Nations had sanctioned that. They had to buy weapons illegally, 80 billion for Iran, 60 billion for Iraq. And according to sources for my book, come from Israeli intelligence and British intelligence, during that decade, Western intelligence agencies, including Israel's intelligence agencies, became corrupt. There was billions, billions of dollars to be made selling arms illegally in the Middle East. And Western intelligence agencies became corrupted. And that corruption has followed through the 80s, the 90s, into the North through the War on Terror to where we are now. And what we're seeing is people protecting those networks and protecting that money um, in these power plays that are going on at the moment. I can explain how, but I should. I think it's a good moment to say, okay, so John's got this nice English chappie. What on earth does he know about power plays in Washington? It goes back to the 80s. If you follow it forward, and I can explain how, I know a bit about it.
I'm not sure that it doesn't go back beyond the 80s, though. Harry Truman, who created the CIA, warned
Yes,
Eisenhower that it had gotten too big, too powerful, and that they were operating outside the margins. Eisenhower told Kennedy that he wanted to tame the CIA. Kennedy tried to tame the CIA, saying that just very publicly that he was going to bust it into 1,000 pieces and
yes.
spread its parts from the Pacific to the Atlantic. And we know what happened to him a short 6 months later. Nixon tried to confront the CIA. He had a contentious conversation with Richard Helms in the Oval Office. Things got very heated, and Nixon looked at Richard Helms and said, "Well, I think I know who killed Jack." A short 6 months later, he was facing impeachment and resigned. So I think that my perception is that, and I don't think it's just the CIA. My understanding is there are 35 distinct intelligence agencies within the United States government, if you include Army intelligence, naval intelligence, and NSA, and it just goes on, that the intelligence community in this nation have seized power. I think they maintain power through blackmail and outright corruption and payments to people. I had a respected national Washington correspondent tell me that they think that if they could count more than 11 true, honest brokers in Congress, that it would be a miracle. That is shocking to me.
I think, John, you're absolutely right. I will be very honest with you. Sometimes I have to be very careful how far I go on a show because I don't want to be painted as a nut job. But
I'm just,
you're absolutely
I worry about that too, but I've just
no,
resigned to the fact that I'm going to be a truth job.
no, absolutely excellent. And I mean, I find myself in friendly company. I find myself in friendly company, so I can agree with this and say yes. I believe personally the CIA was set up um, with a covert agenda to maintain influence of America in the world, and it was not set up to serve the president. It was set up with its own agenda, and it has sought to suborn the presidency over the years to make it to control it. And absolutely. What my information from the 80s is that then became also a money making undertaking because of the war. Same thing with British intelligence. British intelligence old and stayed until the troubles in Northern Ireland in the 70s, when the intelligence agencies and military services in Northern Ireland decided that the politicians in Great Britain, most of whom were socialist at the time in charge of the government, did not know what they were doing. So they decided they could become involved in politics. And they were very much behind the rise of Margaret Thatcher. And she gave them free rein in the 80s. And in addition to operating more freely, they also wanted to make money. And this was one of the sources in my book is a Israeli intelligence officer called Ari Ben Menashe. Some dispute over whether he's former or current. I think he's still current. I think he's acting covertly. And he put it very simply to me. He said, Jeff, we keep talking and you keep asking me for information. You keep trying to paint all of this in terms of intelligence and politics. It was much more nefarious in the 80s. In the 80s, what all of us, what we, he said, all of us were interested in addition to doing jobs for our country, was making money. And that's when the corruption set in. So you're absolutely right about the CIA having power before that. But I think it was the corruption. So how on earth does this relate to Epstein and Russiagate? And again, I want to make the point. We must not lose sight of how awful and reprehensible was Epstein's activity with regards to sexual activities. But actually, Epstein's importance was in arms dealing and money laundering. And those are the two issues that came out of the 80s. And Ari, in another book in 2019, revealed that Epstein had gone to London in the 80s, engaging in many of the same activities that the subject of my book, Hugh Simmons, was engaged in. Not the sexual activities, but he went to London, not then as a rich young man, but as a young man, an ambitious young man. And he met with a gentleman called Douglas Leese, who was a British millionaire, heavily involved in arms dealing and operating under Margaret Thatcher covertly as well. And they were trying to sell arms to Iran. They needed to launder the money back into various places and into the pockets of senior British conservative politicians, intelligence agencies, and so on. And Epstein was involved through that. With that, through Douglas Leese, he met Robert Maxwell, and Robert Maxwell is far more important than Ghislaine Maxwell. Ghislaine Maxwell was seedy. Robert Maxwell, her father, was the man with his finger on the pulse as far as arms dealing and money laundering is concerned. And it was through Douglas Leese that Epstein met Robert Maxwell, and through Robert Maxwell, he met Ari Ben-Menashe. Ari Ben-Menashe recruited Hugh Simmons, the subject of my book, my friend, to operate the money laundering. Money laundering is a fairly sensitive and complex undertaking. It's not just taking some money and running it through a laundry. It's actually kind of complicated. Hugh was a solicitor with a City of London firm of lawyers who specialised. They didn't call it money laundering. They called it money management and tax avoidance. It was nice and clean. But that's what he had. That was his skill, and he lent those skills to these groups of people in London in the 80s, dealing with arms and laundering money. My understanding, what I'm told, is that Hugh got his finger in too many pies, so he ended up dead in the woods. Robert Maxwell also got his finger into too many pies, and he ended up dead in the Mediterranean in 1991. Before he died in London, Robert Maxwell, it is reputed, this is what I've been told, this is research, and it's coming to light now. Robert Maxwell was introduced to Donald Trump. Donald Trump was having trouble with money and his real estate in New York at the time. And there are allegations that he took over Robert Maxwell's money laundering activities, and his organizations may have been involved in money laundering into New York. I say may because I want to be very careful about the politics here. I don't mind telling you, John, I didn't vote for Donald Trump, but that's not the issue here. The issue is what is going on. And it gets a bit murky after that. But definitely there are allegations that Donald Trump was also involved in money laundering. This money laundering was primarily the money from the illegal arms sales was going into Eastern Europe, with the leaders of whom Robert Maxwell had good contacts. He was a British media billionaire. Communist countries needed to deal with the West. They dealt through Robert Maxwell. In addition to getting money into Eastern Europe, towards the end of the 80s as communism was collapsing, Robert Maxwell was helping to get money out of Eastern Europe and out of Russia as their leaders asset stripped their failing economies. This was done in conjunction with the Russian mob, who was led and is still led by a gentleman called Semyon Mogilevich, which is spelled Mogilevich. Semyon was laundering money for Robert Maxwell in conjunction with Hugh Simmons. He was laundering money into Eastern Europe, out of Eastern Europe, and also when Putin took over, he started laundering money for Vladimir Putin, who was apparently asset stripped Russia to the extent of about $70 billion in frozen assets. So if you look at Epstein and you look at his activities in New York, and when he came to New York, he is reputed to have continued operating for the Russian mob in laundering, you find that. As far as Russiagate and Vladimir Putin is concerned, Russiagate wasn't about Vladimir Putin trying to suborn Donald Trump. There is very little information that Donald Trump was suborned by Vladimir Putin in 2016. Let me say, I don't vote for Donald Trump. I'd love to be able to say that's not the case, but there's no evidence that he was suborned by Vladimir Putin. What Putin was doing was he sent agents to Washington in 2016, attempting to suborn any politician, including Donald Trump, including Hillary Clinton and other congresspeople. There's more evidence that Hillary Clinton bought into Putin than Donald Trump. And so, what was Putin up to? Putin was trying to gain favor with American politicians in 2016 to have them repeal legislation that might have frozen his assets. That's what Russiagate was about. So, if you look at Russiagate very closely, you'll find that as well. So, the obvious question arises, if both political parties are corrupted by money laundering, arms, covert agendas, and both of them become visible if you look too closely at Epstein and too closely at Russiagate, why on earth is either party making an issue of it? And the interesting thing is that if you observe what's happened over the last 10 years, actually, what most of the leaders have done in the last 10 years is pulled their punches. Bob Mueller, when he conducted his special counsel investigation, didn't have a conclusion. He didn't say that Donald Trump had done anything wrong. He pulled his punches. Bob Mueller in the noughts reputedly had started an investigation into Donald Trump's money laundering, but it never came to light. When Donald Trump became president, there was activity by Mueller and law enforcement and intelligence agents to try and undermine Donald Trump. It's there. I say this as a Democrat. There was an attempt by intelligence and law enforcement agencies to undermine Donald Trump. But what they never did was they never revealed any evidence about the money laundering. Everyone was pulling their punches until recently. What happened? This is where it's less about covert agendas, John, and it's more about human behavior.
Hmm.
Think of a playground fight
Yep.
between two friends. They're friends and they have an argument about. There's always a little bit of tension between friends, and they start a fight. At first, it's pushing, then it's slapping, then it's punching, and then somebody reaches for an iron bar. I overstate the case, and a teacher intervenes and says, "Guys, what are you doing? What are you doing?" And I think that's what's happening in Washington at the moment. The Democrats have been, and I speak as one, um, sidelined by Trump. Trump is proving to be a very consequential and successful president in terms of implementing his agenda. He owns Washington, and the Democrats have nowhere to turn. So along comes this Epstein scandal, and they jump on board like it's a bandwagon. But aren't they concerned that perhaps revealing these so called Epstein files might not shine light on Clinton and other Democrats like John Podesta and so on? When you're in that playground fight, I don't think you're thinking too clearly. Donald Trump responds to Tulsi Gabbard and looking into Russiagate, but might that not lead to um, Putin laundering money, Donald Trump laundering money, if those allegations are true?
Well,
Yes,
you're
but at the moment, I think they're throwing so much mud, they don't mind where it lands.
well, you do get the prize for being the first person that I've talked to, heard, read that has alleged that Donald Trump was engaged in arms sales or money laundering. Now, I'm open to the possibility. I'm open to receiving information about it. I think that your thesis is contradicted by your own words in that if there was any evidence of what you're alleging, I think that the Democrats and the intelligence community would have hit Donald Trump with it broadsided. And we haven't heard a smattering of that. So,
No,
like I said,
John,
I'm open to receiving information about that. But my instinct is to knee jerk reject that. But I will tell you what I do think. Now, I've heard your hypothesis, and I'm like I said, I'm willing to go down that rabbit hole with you. What I want to believe, and I am clouded by my bias. I did vote for Donald Trump in 2016, by the way. I
yes,
actually predicted to a friend of mine who was Mitt Romney's biggest donor, that Donald Trump would win the 2016 election. We bickered about it for 30 minutes. A year later, he said, "Oh, I saw Donald Trump's election coming from a year ago." I said, "No, you
yeah,
really didn't, because we argued about it."
no,
Anyway, so what I do believe is that Donald Trump definitely has some rough edges about him.
Yes,
I don't think that he is a saint, but I do. What I do observe is that he has raised very fine children. That
yes,
he does not drink. He does not take any substances. In fact, he hates recreational drugs and despises people that do them. He went to Epstein's house in Palm Beach. They were walking distance from one another. He saw the pool filled with young women, and he said that's really creepy. At first, he said, "Isn't that nice that Epstein will let his neighbors come and use his pool?" And then something triggered his instincts, and he said, "This is really something's off here." He went back to Mar-a-Lago and kicked Epstein out of Mar-a-Lago and prohibited him from ever coming back. I think there are more indicia of Donald Trump's goodness than there are indications of his badness, other than his weakness for women. But he also, I don't think, well, I don't know. That's a subject. That's a different hole that pigeonhole that I just sort of, I don't know.
you've been very fair. I'm still here. You didn't turn me off.
What I hope and what I believe we are seeing is perhaps, when I'm mad at somebody, I just go at them. I'm like, all right,
Yeah,
I'll meet you on the playground. Let's settle this.
yes,
Donald
yeah.
Trump is much smarter than I am. I think right now he is not running through the intelligence community. I think he's running around them. And I think that Tulsi Gabbard is his star quarterback right now. And what I believe he is going to do, I hope he's going to do, is dismantle the secret state, the deep state, one brick at a time. I think chapter one is Russia, Russia, Russia. I believe we're beginning to see just little smatterings of unraveling the 2020 election. I think we're going to get some bombshell news pretty soon in Georgia. I'm pretty sure that people are looking very closely at Fonnie Willis and Bill Barr. I think they are looking at the absentee ballots from 2020 are still, so they're supposed to be still in the English Avenue warehouse where they are under court order, a protective order, and a judge ordered those ballots be unsealed and provide them for inspection. That has not happened yet. I think the Justice Department is very aware of that order. I'm hopeful that we will see some movement pretty soon on that. I think that is going to be chapter two in the unraveling of the secret state, the deep state, if you will. And I think and hope that chapter three of the book is going to be an expose and a revelation on what actually happened in Butler, Pennsylvania on July the 13th, 2024. And it is long overdue. We don't have any of the answers yet. I think that when the American people then see the collection, the expose of the demonic state of the secret state, Russia, 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 2020 election, and the Butler attempted assassination, they are going to revolt, and um, their righteousness is going to come to the forefront, and we might have a chance of getting this country back on the right track.
I think that's fair. It's very difficult. I have been asked more than once about um, my investigations, and they've lasted for 30 years, and most of them are first-hand accounts. I'm just not just taken from books and so on. Have said to me, "Do you have any proof?" And I said, "Well, wow. Let me just go out inside and check on the street to see if there's somebody selling bank statements on the corner." There's very little proof for any of this, and it is very difficult when someone says, "Well, okay, so you say that this money laundering was going on," and I have to say, when I say there are allegations that Donald Trump was money laundering, there are allegations that all sorts of people were involved in this, and if you read my book, you will see that there are all sorts of people right up to the current day with the British Labour government of Keir Starmer. Let me just give you an example. Um, Back in the 80s, not just the British Conservative Party, but the British Labour Party were involved in selling arms to Iran and Iraq. That is my information. The arms bagman, the money bagman for the Labour Party was a gentleman by the name of Peter Mandelson, who was a major lieutenant for Tony Blair. And you say, okay, well, that was decades ago, we're like 9 prime ministers further on, except that Keir Starmer, the current Labour Prime Minister, has just appointed now Lord Mandelson, Peter Mandelson, to be his ambassador in Washington. That doesn't mean there's a connection, but the players have still carried forward. But even in England, there has. So coming back to Donald Trump is one of many people about whom these allegations have been made. All I can say to you is read the book. I use my Facebook under the name Geoff Gilson as my blog. I invite people to read, and I'm totally open to people saying, don't believe it. Make up your own mind. That's something I think the American public has got to start doing. Stop following its own galleries. Stop believing what other people tell them. Find out for yourself. Doesn't matter what source you use for news or what source you use for information. Look at the bias of the people concerned. Make up your own mind from the information available. So if people don't want to believe what I say, that's fine. I'm not fussed. But that is my information that is arms laundering and arms dealing and money laundering as covert agendas, and that many people have been involved in this corruption. There are 2 points of view that are advanced about Donald Trump, and I don't fall on either side. I have information going both ways. One is that he was involved and he's protecting. Why isn't he releasing the Epstein files? Secondly, that he's actually trying to clean out the deep state. He's actually trying to clean out the corruption. And what you're seeing is a power play by very powerful people trying to prevent themselves being cleaned out. And John, you and I between us can offer um, evidence and information to support both views. All I can do is offer the elements. I'm not entirely certain which elements are true.
Well, like I said, I'm very open to considering the possibility and receiving information about it. You're just the first person that I've heard that suggested that. But you do have a really good brain, and you are an author. You wrote a book called Maggie's Hammer, and you had to look behind the curtain in the Great Britain into the British government as a speechwriter for Margaret, uh, the Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. And then you had your own podcast called The Real Story,
Yeah.
which was about corruption. Now,
Yes.
I wish you still were operating that. I'd be intrigued to see what you would have to say in 2025.
Well,
Where do you get your information? How do you do your research?
okay, I'll tell you this, and I think I'll tell you why I'm going to explain, just in addition to asking the question, because something that's really exercised me, and I'm absolutely certain it exercises you. I believe that you were the Trump endorsed candidate for Attorney General in Georgia. So
That's correct. That is
we're
correct.
both people, we're both individuals who care about what people think,
Yes.
and I meet a lot of people who say, one more news channel, one more news podcast. Who can I trust? Who do I believe? What's the point? Everyone's corrupt. And I say, well, not everyone is corrupt, but you have to be careful how you get information. This for me started off in 1988. I didn't go looking for any of this. I wanted to be a member of parliament, help people, raise a family, and get on with my life. Then my friend turns up dead. I start following the where it's going, and I've continued following it ever since. Wrote the book and have continued to write. At first, and even to this day, most of the information I rely on is firsthand. I know it sounds crazy. If you read the book, it is kind of crazy in that regard. I would literally go and land on people's doorsteps and pick up the phone and ask. And that's how I met Ari Ben Menashe, an Israeli intelligence officer. I wrote to his publisher. That's how I met my British intelligence informant. I turned up on his doorstep in Glasgow. That's how I spoke to the manager of the branch of a bank called BNL in Atlanta, which financed most of the British arms sales to Iraq, or at least provided some of the seed funding. This bank in Atlanta, I happened to be in Atlanta. I literally rang him up. His telephone number was in the yellow pages, and I rang him up at
Well,
home. And he,
who are you talking about? I I knew about
I'm quoting. Oh, okay, Atlanta. Okay, I'm sorry, John. It's stupid of me. Christopher Dragul, who was the manager of the BNL branch in Atlanta, and I spoke to him and his attorney. And my information from Ari was that in addition to laundering money from arms sales for Margaret Thatcher and Robert Maxwell, my friend Hugh Simmons had specifically been organizing an arms the sale of GEC UK, not US, GEC UK engines to Iraq for $28 million to extend the range of their Scud-B missiles. And the primary beneficiary of that deal was going to be Mark Thatcher, Margaret Thatcher's son. Very specific information. I mean, you were talking earlier about, this information doesn't seem to have come out about money laundering stuff. This was very specific information. So I literally was in Atlanta. I was working with my brother. He was based in Atlanta. I picked up the telephone book. There was Christopher Jewell. I rang, spoke to his wife, and he handed me over. And he said, "Who on earth are you?" And I explained that I was trying to find out what happened to Hugh, primarily for his children, as well as from where it went. And there was this extraordinary reaction. I had this throughout, which is that as soon as you say you're trying to do something for children, people miraculously, John, spoke to me. And so Christopher said, "Yeah." I said, I told him about the deal. He said, "I remember that deal." Do you remember the name Hugh Simmons? Nope. But I specifically remember that deal that came out of England. We issued the letter of credit. Do you have it? Speak to my lawyer. And the lawyer said, "I got 74 boxes of records in a warehouse, and you want to pay me $1,500 to have one of my assistants go and look, I'll get you the letter of credit." That's how I got my information. And if you conjure in your mind a notice board with post-it notes and little circles of activity, they got bigger and bigger and started to coalesce. After that, it's common sense. You paint a scenario. Does this make sense? No, it doesn't make sense. Do I have any way of second sourcing that? Yes. Do I have anything that lends support to what's going on? When Ari Ben Menashe made his allegations about Epstein in London in 2019, being in London in the 80s, a lot of people rejected it. And I was able to write on my blog on Facebook and say, "I don't know. I never met Epstein. I do know Ari, not in contact with him at the moment. But what he is describing has about it the ring of truth." And you move forward, you speak to people, you research, you read books, you paint the best scenario you can. It is, however, John, necessarily all of it circumstantial. And so, getting back to the issue of Donald Trump, I have two very separate groups of post it notes. This group over here has a number of documented reports that have been produced talking about money laundering out of Russia, possibly into real estate in New York. This other group of post-it notes says, "Look at what Donald Trump suffered in his first term at the hands of law enforcement and intelligence agencies who were hell-bent on undermining him." I wrote at the time, James Clapper and John Brennan, is it,
yeah.
were constantly quoted in the papers. And I would turn around to my liberal friends and say, I know enough about national security to know that whether they like their president or not, they are revealing national security secrets in order to undermine him. What is going on? That was very obvious. The whole business with Russiagate was, I'd say, a nonsense, but nonsense is too
Trivial.
passive a word. And I say this about both of them. I don't think that Hillary Clinton should have been investigated during the presidential campaign, and neither should Donald Trump. Do I think Obama was behind it? Absolutely, I do. The buck stops with the president.
I think Tulsi Gabbard largely unmasked the maybe the head of the snake in
Yes,
identifying Obama, Clinton, Clapper, Comey.
I have no doubt about it. So there is equally this evidence that Donald Trump is trying to clean house, and that appears to be what he's trying to do.
I think, and that I celebrate that.
You have these two conflicting possibilities. What I do think is true is there are big power plays going on in Washington. When you look immediately at Epstein and Russiagate, it doesn't make sense because they're old stories. Why would they be revived? And I say, look to see if there's something else going on behind it. I don't think your average listener of you, and I'm not being rude, can pick up the phone tomorrow and resolve the Russiagate and Epstein scandals on their own. What they can do is this: all of these people live somewhere. There's a movie like Body of Lies. It's called Body of Lies with Leonardo DiCaprio and Russell Crowe. I think that's his name, Russell Crowe. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie, But basically,
I
Leonardo DiCaprio is a CIA agent operating in the Lebanon, and Russell Crowe is his controller back in Washington. And you constantly see him with his earplugs in, directing what Leonardo. Where are you now? Okay, turn right. There's a satellite right above you. We're sending in the Defender missiles immediately. And no, no, honey, no, not that ice cream. Get the other ice cream. He's shopping. He's taking his kids to school. He's got his earphones on, but he's controlling CIA activities. Everybody lives somewhere. So if these nefarious people are living somewhere, and like my friend turning up dead in the woods, you as a listener or if you see something going on, ask questions. That's how you find out. That's how anybody finds out. Ask questions and see where it goes. If it gets frightening, stop doing it. I've been threatened. People say, "Why do you continue if you're threatened?" I said, "I'm too stupid to stop." But ask questions because I don't think you're going to get the answer from politicians or from the media. They are, to use the word in a different context, now too corrupted. They're too bought into one side or another. But we, the people, we can. But we've got to be alert enough and brave enough to ask the questions when we see stuff going on around us that doesn't add up because you have no idea if the person two houses down from you isn't actually a regional director for the CIA. You have
yeah,
no idea.
yeah. Well, the CIA has its tentacles spread throughout this country. They are embedded in every media outlet in America today,
Yes.
the mainstream media. We just know that. I mean, it's not a secret. Nobody challenges it. They
No.
have also embedded themselves in every department of the federal government. And so it is a monster. So look, sometimes people say, stop interrupting your guest. The problem is radio doesn't allow long form. So I got about 15 or 20 minutes left, and I want to ask you three or four questions. And
Absolutely.
let's just focus on them in kind of rapid fire succession here, if we could. Um, One is, this is kind of philosophical, and I can't get my hands around the answer really. But we're not happy with the deeds of our own intelligence community. We don't trust MI6. We don't trust Mossad. We know we don't trust the KGB. But here's the thing: is it time for our country to put on our big boy pants and just realize that we can be goody two shoes and have this kind of fantasy of what we would like the world to be like? Or do we acknowledge that the world is a mean and sometimes very bad place and bad things happen? If we don't play the game, if we don't have a CIA that is willing to, I don't know, maybe create a honey trap where they lure high powered people into so that they can control them or get information from them, including foreign actors. If we're not willing to stoop to those lows, are we risking that these other players will have better intelligence, better abilities and capabilities than we will? And at the end of the day, in the long game, we lose. What do you think?
I think that's a very fair question, and it's a difficult question to answer. The word that's in my mind is realpolitik. Um, I remember during the last election, some of my liberal friends would say to me, "How on earth can you predict, as I did, that Donald Trump was going to win in 2024?" And I said, "Because I keep my ear to the ground, I read a lot, I talk to people, for some reason, John, I have this sixth sense about just being able to feel things. I said to my liberal friends, you want to go into Walmart. If all you're going to do is go into your independent bookstore and hang out with your hoity-toity friends and you're not actually feeling the pulse. And um, my sense in 2024, leaving aside all of the high-flown arguments one way and the other, was that ordinary people of whatever color and gender, race, whatever, looked out at the world and saw ogres in charge of other countries. Putin, Russia, Xi Jinping in China, North Korea, even people like Narendra Modi in India, and strong-willed politicians in Europe taking America for a ride. That's what they saw. They saw their jobs getting lost. They saw us getting beaten up on trade, and America no longer respected. And they said, not we want a gentleman or someone in pajamas or Jimmy Cooper coming to Washington in the White House. We want our own thug. And I'll put it like that, even if it offends your viewers and listeners. We want somebody, we want our own strongman. And I said, that's why Donald Trump is going to win. Well, this left my liberal friends speechless. You cannot view politics in that way. Yes, you can. And the American people did. And I say that neither in support of nor denigration of Donald Trump. He's a strong man. And that's what American people wanted. Same thing is true with intelligence services.
Yeah, go ahead.
You're not playing a clean game. You're
Hmm.
playing a dirty game. And here's the problem, John. I mean, I've been trying to expose corruption, and I say, well, I don't mind intelligence agencies being strong. I could say, so long as they're not corrupt. Okay, yes, I think we need to keep it under control. Yes, I think there's a chance that Donald Trump is trying to clean out corruption in the intelligence agencies, not just getting rid of people who don't support him politically. I don't think Donald Trump's ever had any trouble with people who don't support him politically. He has Tulsi Gabbard in his cabinet. He has RFK Jr. in his cabinet. He has no problem with people who are strong-willed in intelligence and don't necessarily agree with them. Marco Rubio, he may well be trying to clean out the corruption, but it's difficult. If you have undertakings that you have to, if you have activities you have to undertake in the dirty world of covert intelligence activities, and you can't talk about it, and you can't get funding from Congress, how do you fund it? If not through dirty dealings and corruption. I go one step further than you in that regard. Sometimes maybe you need corruption intelligence agencies to finance the nefarious activities. Where do you draw the line? You draw the line by trusting the people you elect. That's what you have to do.
Well, and that's fine as long as the people that we elect are actually elected. And I can tell you
Yeah.
with 100% certainty that Georgia was stolen in 2020. I've seen the evidence. I've cross-examined our expert witnesses. I've talked to eyewitnesses who saw 20,000 pristine ballots, all scored identically in the State Farm Center, waiting to be
Yes.
tabulated. There's just no doubt in my mind. So if you have a duly elected president like Donald Trump, then I'm all about it. If the intelligence community decides that they want to put their own puppet into office, which is exactly what I believe happened in 2020, and I think Bill Barr was part of it. I think Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, Clapper, Comey, and Brennan were all part of it. I'm not down with that. So that's where you draw the line. And that's the line they've crossed. And I think that is what Donald Trump is going to hold them accountable for.
Yes.
I don't think that Donald Trump's trying to put a clamp on the Epstein files has anything to do with him. I don't think he's in the files. I don't think he's trying to hide anything or protect anybody. What I do think he is doing is he recognizes that it was an intelligence operation and he is trying to preserve the good parts of the intelligence community without destroying them. And I'm not saying legitimize or support what they did with Epstein, but I don't think he wants to completely wreck our intelligence community. It filled a valuable service. And if he exposes them for everything that they're worth, it may have that effect. So I think he's walking this very high wire, like Lech Walesa, who crossed the Tallulah Gorge, which is where you used to live. I think he's walking that line and he's trying to get the corruption out, but keep the legitimate activities of the intelligence community intact. What do you?
John, I'm enjoying this to and fro, and now I'm going to slightly throw back with you that your own words are actually just helped what I was saying earlier. You were
Yeah,
saying
no, I'm
if what was
supporting what you
true,
said earlier.
if what was true saying about Donald Trump is or is not true, why hasn't it come out? I think that there are politicians on both sides of the aisle in Washington who are engaged in a power play of trying to expose and maybe harming those James Clapper and John Brennan in 2016-17 were so keen to bring down Donald Trump. They were exposing matters they should not have been exposing. I actually do believe, and I've said this to my liberal friends, One of the reasons I believe that Donald Trump is not exposing the Epstein files is because there is nefarious activity there. I think it's about money laundering and arms dealing. Maybe it's something else.
And I think it traces directly back to our intelligence community.
Yeah, I think he's taken the view and that there's some stuff that is so awful that what little trust the American people have left in their government would be undermined if it was revealed.
You and I are on the same page.
I think that, but I also think there could be said of certain Democratic leaders about why they may not have exposed the information about Trump if those allegations are true. I don't know. I think both sides are acting badly, but also to some extent, some of the actors on both sides, and Donald Trump may be one of them, realize that the information that may be exposed is so awful it would undermine Americans' trust in their own government. That is certainly what I have come across in Great Britain. I've spoken to fairly high-ranking politicians and media people in Great Britain and said, okay, I've painted this fairly coherent picture of what was going on and is still going on in Great Britain. None of you are picking it up. And one or two of them, well-known journalists, have said to me privately, the reason we haven't picked it up is this, Jeff. We know it's true. Everybody knows it's true. Everybody knows that the British body politic and its intelligence and military services were corrupted in the 80s and remain corrupted by arms dealing and money laundering. We know that. What could we possibly do? Quite aside from safety concerns, one or two have turned up dead. What are we going to do? Are we going to destroy the country because of what is now a part of its makeup? We do what we can around the edges and we try to make the country better. So I think there are people, and it may include Donald Trump, who see what may be behind Epstein and want simply to sit on it. Because I agree with you in this regard. We know all that there is about Donald Trump and Epstein. Epstein, for whatever else he was doing, was a major figure in New York well before all of his reprehensible activities became public. He owned, I believe, one of the largest mansions in New York. Everybody was going to his parties.
Yeah.
Everybody was on his plane. And all of the evidence that I have seen suggests that as soon as Donald Trump found out about it, he cut him off. I was watching a video last evening, just last evening, of a panel of so-called alleged survivors. I'm not denigrating them, I'm just being careful, on NBC, not a known friend of Donald Trump. And the moderator very sensibly asked a question of the whole audience, and she was very clear. She said, do you, any of you here, have direct evidence or even second-hand information that President Donald Trump was involved in any of this activity? And the answer came back from all of them, no.
Yeah. I think you and I are pretty aligned on this, actually, Jeff. So we got pitifully short time remaining. Let me ask you, you've alluded three times now to your friend and I guess
Yes.
business associate who lost his life in Great Britain in the 80s. Tell us his name and you've talked about it, but I didn't catch all of it. Just what was he engaged in and who took him out and for what reasons?
Okay. Hugh Simmons was my friend. He was 8 years older than me. He was my political mentor, and I worked for him in his law office as a senior employee as we were both working our way to becoming members of parliament. He was what they describe as a rising star in the 70s and 80s in the British Conservative Party. He was a speechwriter for Margaret Thatcher as I was. He was involved very heavily in what would be the equivalent of, say, the RNC in the British Conservative Party. He was going to be a member of Parliament. Everyone knew he was going to be a cabinet minister. He was also proving to be quite a successful lawyer and British businessman before he turned up dead. Once he turned up dead, I started asking questions.
What was his name?
Oh, sorry, Hugh Simmons.
Hugh Simmons. All right.
I started asking questions about, why he might have died. That drew me into this whole intelligence world. Once I found out he was a senior intelligence officer, and I followed leads from one to the other and ended up talking with British intelligence officers and Harry Ben Menashe and other Israeli intelligence officers, and formed this picture that in the 80s there had been this corruption in British intelligence with arms dealing in Iran and Iraq and money laundering back through to the British Conservative Party and the British Labour Party, Mark Thatcher, and through the British Labour Party, which he supported Robert Maxwell, through him into Eastern Europe. And then when I went up with Ari Behrman, actually he painted the bigger picture of not just British intelligence, but the CIA and Israeli intelligence. Your viewers may know, obviously, of Iran Contra. Oliver North was
Sure.
a sideshow. He
Yeah.
was responsible for about $1 billion in arms. Tens of billions of dollars were being sold. Ari was part of the group that uncovered Oliver North in Lebanon to throw him to the wolves so that Congress would look at him rather than at Ari. My friend turned up dead in the woods in November 1988. I have not been able to determine how or who or why. Ari,
How did he die? What was his cause of death?
he ostensibly died of um, gas poisoning, the exhaust in through the window. Um, there was the autopsy was signed by a gentleman who later became defense minister
Hmm.
under John Major, which is kind of interesting. Um, there is my British intelligence sources tell me he was murdered at the scene. Ari tells me it was British intelligence. British intelligence tell me it was Ari. And I'm still friends with
What a
Ari in this
tangled
rather
web.
curious way. What Ari ended up saying was, "You're spending too much time on this, Jeff. He had too many fingers in too many pies." At the end of the 80s, a lot of agencies were cleaning up what they'd been doing in the 80s, and there were dirty laundry lists. And your mate, he said, was on everybody's dirty laundry list. So it wasn't just that he was a friend of mine who was involved. He was actually engaged with all of these characters, Robert Maxwell, Ari Ben Menashe. I've no connection to Epstein, but certainly connections to Mark and Dennis, Thatcher, and to Semyon Moyelevich. And that's why he died.
So you have a lot of information, and you have given us generously of your time and knowledge. Do you worry at all about being as outspoken as you are? And I mean, if it could happen to Hugh, do you worry that maybe you're on somebody's list?
Well, I would say three things, because I like to put things in three. One, I've been told not to return to Europe. Two, I've also been told that now that I do things like this, I talk about it so much that if I was to turn up face down in a canal, people would ask questions they're not asking at the moment. I mean, I don't mean this in a disrespectful way, John. There's a smile on my face. But earlier on, you very nicely said, "Oof, that's not my information. I'm having trouble believing what you're saying." You didn't put it quite like that. You were very nice about it. Well, I get that all the time. I turn up face down in a canal, people start believing. And the third thing is,
Hmm.
this all happened or
Interesting.
started to happen 37, 38 years ago. I do not get into my car without looking under it. When I come back to my apartment, I check every closet and the bathroom behind the shower curtain. I don't even think about it every time.
So you know, my I've got a journalistic brain. I just have to ask you, Jeff.
Yes.
Are you tied to any intelligence agency? Because you sure seem to pack a lot of knowledge.
No, now that is a really good question, and you are the very first person who has said that. It's on
I'm
the
not
lines of
saying that.
Jeff.
I'm
No,
asking.
no, 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 John.
Not an
You can.
implication. I just want to
It's a
know.
very fair question. You say so. You just sat here for an hour saying people have agendas and they have serious. Are you on my show with an agenda? No, I have absolutely no connection to intelligence agencies. Um, I think we both believe in God, and I believe to this extent. I was gifted a brain. Sometimes, John, I stand outside myself and say, "What is this thing? Where is it going?" And I have a brain that works tirelessly, that makes connections and creates patterns that other people don't. I'm very happy to have this brain. I'm very proud of it. Uh, I didn't make it. I didn't develop it. I was gifted it. And I have had more than one intelligence officer say to me, "How on earth do you know this?" Know what? What you just told me. Well, I have
My
my
point.
sources. I have my sources, and they say, "Oh, okay, well, I'm going to give you one more piece of information," and I go to the next person, and now I've not got 7 pieces of information. I've got 8 pieces of information. Nope, this is all homegrown. I'm not affiliated to any intelligence agency. In fact, since we're getting close to the end, and I will just make this as a plea, people say, "Well, have you been bought off?" Bought off,
No,
John. Chance would be a fine thing.
I don't get that sense at all. But so I get 2 points, and then we got to go. One,
Yeah,
um, we interviewed a guy a month or so ago, and I finished the interview, and I looked at Anthony, my producer, and I said, we both kind of almost simultaneously said, "Can you believe how full of it that guy was?" And I asked him if he was CIA, and he dodged the question,
Yeah.
making me believe that he wanted me to believe that he
Yes.
was CIA, and he had no
Yes.
connection whatsoever. He
Yes.
was just
Oh,
full of it. My second point is that, I'm on holiday right now, and my wife said, and my producer said, "John, why don't you take the day off? You're out in LA to see your new grandson. You're on vacation. Why are you working?" And I will tell you point blank, it's because I have loved the hour that I have spent with you. I
no, thank you.
think you might be intelligence because you're actually denying it, which almost is an admission to me. But it's not an out.
Well,
It's not.
let me put it like this: if I'm
It's
intelligence,
just a thought.
I don't have the paycheck to go with it. But I will say this, and it goes back to an earlier point about who do you believe and what do you believe. Don't believe. I say this to all of your viewers: don't believe a word I've said. Go out and prove it for yourself. If I am an example of anything, it's what an ordinary guy can find out if he asks the questions. Now, granted, I don't expect everyone to give up 30 years of their life to do it, but ask your own questions. Don't accept what I've said is true. Test it.
Well, the fact is, we talked for an hour, and I really
Yes.
only challenged you on one thing, and that is Donald Trump's money laundering uh,
Yeah.
allegation that you made. And I'm not saying that you're wrong. I'm just saying that I've never heard it before, but I'm
Yes.
open to receiving information to support or refute that speculation. So, with that, Geoff Gilson, I want to thank you for coming on. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I don't think you're full of it at all. Everything you have said actually has the ring of truth to it. And that probably is the reason that I really don't think that you're intelligence. But as a journalist, I really felt the need to ask.
You're the first person that's asked, and well done. And
I'm
John,
probably
thank you
one
for
of the
having me.
smartest interviewers you've ever had.
Yeah. And thank you for having me on your show. I've enjoyed it immensely as well.
Well, it's been a pleasure. A lawyer, author, and political strategist. He talks funny. That's because he's from the UK, but he sure does have a great brain. He knew Maggie Thatcher. He wrote speeches for her, and he has a book that he wrote about Ms. Thatcher called Maggie's Hammer. And you can find it where, Geoff?
It's Maggies. If you Google Maggie's Hammer and Geoff Gilson, that's Jeff spelled the British way, with a Geoff. You Google that, and you'll find the book.
Well, it's been a pleasure, and thank you for coming on The Truth today.
That's my pleasure, and thank you, John.